Office 365 and Azure PowerShell. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we're going to get our system installed and configured so that we can run Microsoft PowerShell commands to manage and administer our Office 365 tenant. Now this is important because there's going to be a lot of PowerShell throughout the remainder of this nugget series, and to be perfectly frank, there's a lot of PowerShell on the 70-346 exam, so you want to have your system set up so that you can actually play around with these commands and actually use them and learn them as opposed to just reading about them in reference documentation. The user interface for Office 365, found at portal.office.com, is pretty great. It allows you to do just about anything you need to do inside of the Office 365 system. But when it comes to administering a system, even Office 365 online, sometimes a graphical user interface is not always the ideal way to interact with a system. Sometimes you need a way that you can script out or automate tasks and processes that you want to administer. Microsoft recognizes this, and for the past few years, they've been pushing a system called PowerShell, Windows PowerShell. And if you're unfamiliar with PowerShell, well, I would recommend that you take a look at Garth Schulte's awesome PowerShell 4.0 course right here at CBT Nuggets. But PowerShell is nothing more than a command line script for Microsoft Windows. And Microsoft allows you to administer just about everything in the Windows ecosystem with PowerShell. That includes all of their different server products, SQL Server, their web server products, right on down the line, up to and including Office 365. Now, getting up and running with PowerShell for Office 365 does mean downloading and installing a couple of different utilities and modules so that you have everything that you need in order to run the PowerShell commands. One of the things that you're going to notice is we are going to use the phrase Azure quite a bit here. And if you're wondering why we're talking about Azure in an Office 365 course, well, you're getting a little peek behind the curtain, so to speak. Office 365 actually runs on Microsoft Azure. You don't even realize it, but all of the users that you create in Office 365, for instance, are being stored in what's known as Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So you're interacting quite a bit with Microsoft Azure when you use Office 365, even if you don't realize it. So a lot of the PowerShell commands that were built to manage and administer Microsoft Azure are also used to manage and administer Office 365. So let's talk about how we get this up and running on our system. I'm going to walk through it right here in this window for you. To begin with, you want to make sure that you install what's known as the Azure Active Directory Connection Tool. This is going to download some libraries that allows your local machine, your local development desktop, to connect to the remote Azure Active Directory. Remember, that's where all of your users in Microsoft Office 365 are stored. So you're going to need this utility. I've got the URL right here on screen. We're going to download that in a moment. The second thing that you need to do is you need to install the Azure PowerShell modules. I warned you we were going to say Azure a whole lot. So we're going to install two different modules inside of our PowerShell system, Azure RM and just plain old Azure. Why do we have two of them? Well, Microsoft Azure has been in the process over the past year and a half or so of switching from the traditional Azure into the Azure Resource Manager, Azure RM. There still are a few features, I don't think very many, but a few that require the old Azure module. It is a legacy module that's slowly being phased out and everything's being moved into Azure RM. But for the time being, you want to make sure that you have both of these modules installed. Lastly, you're going to need to run something called connect-msol service. This is what's going to connect your local desktop to the Microsoft Online Service, Azure Active Directory. It's worth noting that you're not going to be able to run this PowerShell command until you've run step 1 and installed that Azure AD connection tool. There's a lot more details of this URL right here about connecting to Azure Active Directory. We'll take a look at that page as well. Now lastly, if you're wondering if you are in fact ready to go and do this and follow along, there are very few prerequisites to do this. You need PowerShell 4.0 and you need .NET 3.5 or later. And basically, if you're running on Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 10, or if you are running on Windows Server 2008 or later, you're good to go. You don't have to worry about it. You've got all the tools and utilities that you need to run this. Anything earlier than that, and you may need to make sure that you've upgraded to one of these two systems. Alright, so let's switch over to a web browser and get step 1, the Azure Active Directory connection downloaded. It's a simple page, but there are a couple of different options you're going to want to pay attention to down here at the bottom. Notice these two files in the middle here that have the smaller file sizes. These are actually PDFs. You don't want to download these, or rather if you want to download and read them, you will. But what you want to download to install is one of these MSI files. Either the GA version, which is general availability, that's basically the current stable version, or this dash preview version, which is a newer version, but it's got some preview features that may not be fully functioning or fully supported. For our purposes, yeah, I'm just going to download the GA version, download the link right here, and then run this utility to install it. Once that completes, you can click Finish to close the wizard. I'm going to bring up my PowerShell command prompt here, and notice that I'm running in administrator mode. This is an elevated PowerShell command prompt. In order to install modules, you have to be in an elevated mode. And first I want to install the Azure RM module. Just install -module space Azure RM. I'm going to include the -force parameter because I believe I may already have it installed. Nope, of course I got to spell it right. I believe I may already have it installed, so including -force will ensure that it reruns the install and gets the latest version installed for me. This can take a few minutes to complete, so we're just going to let it run here. It may prompt you for a couple of different confirmations during the install. You're going to want to say yes to those while you wait for it to run. And here you can just see it downloading and installing, unzipping all the different modules that are associated with the Azure RM module itself. And the second thing I want to install is just the Azure module. And again, I'm going to include the -force to make sure that I install the latest, most up-to-date version of this particular package. Again, we can see it downloading here. I've just sped up the video to get through this as quickly as we can. Okay, and once that's complete, you'll notice that I did get a couple of error messages in text here. They're nothing to worry about. It just says that the get Azure Storage Container ACL command is already available on the system, so it didn't reinstall it. Again, that's probably because I've installed these things many times over, and it's just not wanting to overwrite or remove something that I already have installed. The last thing I should be able to do is to connect to the MS Online service with connect-msol service commandlet. When I run this, what it's going to do is bring up a login dialog box for Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to log in as my user. And now my session is connected to Azure Active Directory. A simple way to test that out is I can simply run the get-msol user. That's MS Online Services user. And this should return all of the users inside of my Active Directory. There they are, Ben Finkel at CBT Office and my CBT and super user. So I'm now connected in this PowerShell window to my Azure Active Directory service that is behind my Office 365 service. One important thing to note here, that connect-msol service is only active for this session of PowerShell. So if I open up a brand new PowerShell window and I try to get MSOL user from here, you can see it's actually going to yell at me. I have to call the connect MSOL service commandlet first. So every time you open a new PowerShell window, you do need to recall that connect in order to get connected up to your backend system. Another important thing to note, if you're wondering about what the heck MSOL is supposed to be, Microsoft Online Service, that's the old name for what is now Azure Active Directory. A lot of what you do through PowerShell with Office 365 is actually connected to Azure Active Directory. You're going to use these MSOL commandlets a lot. You'll see it all throughout the Nugget series here on administering Office 365. So get used to those commandlets. You can see reference documentation for all these commandlets up here at this URL. I showed this to you earlier. Notice down the left-hand side you have all of the different PowerShell commandlets that you might use for MSOL. And actually this main page right here has a great install AD module paragraph that explains what we just went through, how you can install the Active Directory module. Another thing that's worth pointing out, it's still in preview mode. It's not being used yet, but Azure Active Directory PowerShell module version 2 over here on the left has a slightly different install system. You actually update it by calling the get module commandlet inside of PowerShell, so it's a little bit easier and a little bit more sensible to install and run version 2, but it is only in preview mode right now, so it has not yet been released for general availability. Well, that concludes this nugget on Office 365 and Azure PowerShell. Just to recap, we installed and configured our system so that we can run Office 365 and Azure PowerShell commandlets so that we can play around with these commands throughout the remainder of this Nugget series and really learn how to use these commands. There were 3 steps that we needed to perform: 2 one-time installations of Azure modules in PowerShell and an Active Directory connection tool, and then we had to set up and use our connect-msol service commandlet in every new PowerShell session that we start up. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.